23 wagons rolled into the mist-shrouded gap between Grandfather Mountain and Rough Ridge on October 15, 1799, their iron-rimmed wheels grinding against granite that had never felt the weight of civilization. Only 5 people would emerge alive from what the Cherokee called the valley where spirits feed. This is the story of the Harwick Company wagon train, and how a family's blood-soaked claim to wilderness territory turned westward expansion into a feeding ground for something far darker than bears or starvation. Samuel Harwick stood on his wagon's driving board that crisp autumn morning, surveying the Blue Ridge peaks that stretched beyond sight like the backbone of a sleeping giant. Pine smoke drifted from the cooking fires of 47 souls who'd paid him their life savings for safe passage to the fertile valleys of Tennessee. The air carried the bite of coming winter, and something else, something that made the oxen shift restlessly in their traces. Before we venture deeper into these haunted mountains, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories of vanished wagon trains fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in Appalachian folklore for over 2 centuries. The Harwick Company had advertised in Philadelphia newspapers all summer, promising safe and expeditious passage to the Tennessee territories via proven mountain routes. Samuel Harwick claimed 15 years' experience guiding settlers through the wilderness gaps. His credentials seemed solid: letters of recommendation from previous clients, detailed maps of mountain passes, even testimonials from families who'd supposedly reached their destinations safely. What those testimonials didn't mention was that every previous Harwick expedition had encountered the Grayson family. The Graysons had claimed their mountain territory in 1776, settling in a hollow so remote that no surveyor's chain had ever measured its boundaries. Ezekiel Grayson, his wife Mercy, and their 4 adult sons lived by hunting, trapping, and what they called toll collection from travelers who passed through their domain. The toll wasn't always money. From the diary of Rebecca Thornfield, found decades later, October 14th, 1799, Mr. Harwick speaks with great confidence of our route, yet I notice how his voice changes when mentioning the high country. The other guides whisper of families who guard the passes. Guard them from what, I wonder? The first sign of trouble came at dawn on the 2nd day. Young Thomas Brennan, riding scout ahead of the main column, returned with news that chilled the morning air. The established trail ahead was blocked by fallen trees, massive pines that looked deliberately felled. The trunks bore axe marks too fresh to be from winter storms. Landslide, Harwick announced to the gathered families, his voice carrying false confidence. We'll take the northern pass through Devil's Gap. Adds half a day, nothing more. But Martha Creighton, the widow traveling with her 3 children, had noticed something others missed. The fallen trees were arranged in a pattern, creating channels that would funnel travelers towards specific gaps in the forest. Someone had engineered this obstacle. The wagons creaked and groaned as they climbed the steeper route, following deer paths that barely accommodated their wheels. The forest grew denser, older, filled with chestnuts and oaks that had never felt an axe. Sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting everything in green twilight that made noon feel like dusk. That's when they met Ezekiel Grayson. He emerged from the tree line like a wraith given flesh, a man so weathered by mountain living that moss seemed to grow in the creases of his buckskins. Behind him came his sons, Caleb, Josiah, Marcus, and young Abel, each carrying long rifles with the casual ease of men who'd never missed their target. "Fine morning for traveling," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying the slow cadence of someone who measured words like powder charges. Though these paths can be treacherous for those who don't know their secrets, death walked beside them now. The Grayson patriarch's eyes moved across the wagon train with the calculation of a butcher selecting cattle, lingering on the women, counting the children, estimating the value of goods beneath canvas covers. His sons spread out along the trail's edges, their rifles never quite pointing at anyone, yet somehow threatening everyone. "We're bound for Tennessee," Harwick replied, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Following the established routes through the Gap Country. Established by whom? Ezekiel's smile revealed teeth stained dark by mountain tobacco. "These mountains don't recognize any authority but the families who've bled to hold them. We've been collecting passage fees since before the revolution ended." The conversation that followed would determine who lived and who vanished into Appalachian legend, but none of the 47 souls in that wagon train could have imagined the price the Graysons would demand for safe passage through their mountain kingdom. Ezekiel Grayson's weathered hand gestured toward the laden wagons like a patriarch blessing his flock, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator selecting prey. The mountain silence pressed against 47 souls who suddenly understood they were no longer travelers, but bargaining chips in a game whose rules had been written in blood. The Grayson family's toll collection had funded their mountain kingdom for over 2 decades, turning westward migration into a carefully orchestrated harvest of human desperation. Samuel Harwick dismounted his wagon with the careful movements of a man who'd recognized his mistake too late. The morning mist clung to the hollow like gunpowder smoke, carrying the scent of pine sap and something else, something that made the horses stamp nervously despite the stillness. Every family clustered around their wagons could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes watching from the tree line. "What manner of fee do you require?" Harwick asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Ezekiel's sons had positioned themselves with military precision. Caleb, the eldest at 32, commanded the high ground where his rifle could sweep the entire wagon train. Josiah and Marcus flanked the narrow trail, cutting off retreat. Young Abel, barely 20 but already carrying his father's coldness, blocked the path forward. They moved like wolves who'd practiced this hunt countless times. "Depends on what you're carrying," Ezekiel replied, circling Harwick's lead wagon with predatory patience. "And what you're willing to part with to see Tennessee dirt." From a letter found in the ruins of Fort Campbell, dated November 1st, 1799. No word from the Harwick party. Expected arrival 3 weeks past. Fear the worst has befallen them in the high country. The negotiation that followed revealed the true horror of the Grayson operation. They didn't simply demand money or supplies. They demanded choices that would haunt survivors for generations. Families could pass safely by surrendering their eldest children as mountain apprentices. Single women could buy passage through marriage to Grayson's sons. Men could earn safe conduct by joining their raids against other wagon trains. Martha Creighton clutched her 3 children closer as Ezekiel's gaze lingered on her 12-year-old son, James. The widow had sold everything she owned for this journey west, carrying her life savings in a leather pouch sewn into her corset. But money wasn't what the mountain patriarch was pricing. "Fine, strong boy," Ezekiel observed, his voice carrying casual menace. "Mountains need young backs to work the trap lines." The other families watched in silence that bordered on complicity. Not one voice rose in protest as the Graysons cataloged human inventory. The Brennan family, traveling with 4 daughters, saw how Marcus Grayson studied the 2 eldest girls. The Hendersons, carrying tools and seed for a Tennessee farm, noticed how Caleb appraised their wagon's contents with professional interest. What would you have done, watching children being evaluated like livestock? Would you have spoken out, knowing it might doom your own family? The mountains had taught the Graysons patience. They'd spent 23 years perfecting this system, learning which travelers would fight and which would comply. Ezekiel understood that desperation made people malleable, that the promise of eventual safety could justify immediate sacrifice. He'd watched families tear themselves apart, choosing which children to surrender, which possessions to abandon. "We ain't bandits," he explained to the gathered settlers, his tone almost conversational. "We're businessmen. These mountains don't give up their secrets for free. Every safe passage requires investment." Samuel Harwick had led wagon trains through these gaps before, always managing to negotiate reasonable tolls. But this October morning felt different. The Graysons seemed hungrier, more demanding. What he didn't know was that their mountain territory was shrinking. Government surveyors had been mapping the region all summer, preparing for the road building that would bypass family-controlled passes entirely. This might be their last major harvest. Rebecca Thornfield, the school teacher traveling alone to establish a school in Nashville, watched the negotiations with the sharp intelligence that had made her invaluable in Philadelphia society. She recognized something others missed. The Graysons weren't just collecting tolls, they were recruiting, building their isolated community with the strongest, smartest, most useful members of each passing wagon train. The family compound, hidden deeper in the mountains, must house dozens of apprentices and wives collected over the years, people who'd learned that survival meant becoming complicit in the system that had trapped them. "Time's wasting," Josiah Grayson announced, checking the sun's position through the forest canopy. "Make your choices before dark, or we make them for you." The ultimatum hung in the mountain air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying the promise of decisions that would echo through generations. But none of the 47 souls in the Harwick wagon train could have predicted which choice would transform their westward journey into a feeding ground for something far hungrier than mountain bandits. The screech of a red-tailed hawk split the mountain silence as families huddled around their wagons, weighing choices that would damn them regardless of what they decided. Pine needles crunched underfoot as children pressed closer to their parents, sensing the predatory tension that crackled through the hollow like lightning before a storm. These weren't negotiations anymore, but an auction where human lives served as currency, and the Graysons held every advantage. Martha Creighton made the first terrible choice. Her hands shook as she counted out 47 silver dollars, everything she'd saved for her new life in Tennessee. But Ezekiel Grayson barely glanced at the coins before pushing them aside like worthless pebbles. "Money's got no value up here, widow. What feeds families in winter ain't silver. It's strong backs and willing hands." His eyes remained fixed on her 12-year-old son James, a bright boy who'd been helping other families repair their wagon wheels since Philadelphia, the kind of useful intelligence that mountain communities needed to survive. Young James stepped forward with the startling courage of children who haven't learned proper fear yet. "I'll stay if it means Ma and my sisters can pass safely." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Martha's anguished sob echoed off granite walls that had witnessed this scene too many times before. But what broke the witnesses wasn't just a mother's grief. It was the boy's acceptance, the way he'd already resigned himself to becoming property. From the personal journal of Dr. Henry Walsh, recovered from the Grayson compound in 1821, found evidence of at least 30 children taken from wagon trains between 1776 and 1800. Most showed signs of Stockholm Syndrome, defending their captors even after rescue attempts. The Brennan family faced their own impossible mathematics. 4 daughters, ages 14 through 22, traveling with parents who'd mortgaged their Pennsylvania farm for this westward gamble. Marcus Grayson's interest in the 2 eldest wasn't subtle, his mountain-roughened hands gesturing toward them like a trader examining horseflesh. "Pretty girls deserve mountain husbands," he announced with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never been refused. "Better than whatever waits in Tennessee territory." Thomas Brennan, the family patriarch, possessed the build of a man who'd spent decades working stone and soil, but his shoulders sagged under the weight of choices no father should face. His wife Catherine clutched their youngest daughter while watching her older girls with the hollow stare of someone calculating which sacrifice might save the others. The Hendersons chose compliance over resistance. William Henderson agreed to join the Grayson raids, his carpentry skills valuable for maintaining their mountain compound. His wife Eleanor would remain as unpaid labor, cooking and cleaning for a family that had transformed survival into systematic predation. None but the mountains witnessed. Other wagon trains had passed through these gaps over the decades, but survivors rarely spoke of their experiences. The shame of collaboration, the guilt of watching neighbors sacrificed for their own safety, created a conspiracy of silence that protected the Grayson operation better than any military fortification. Rebecca Thornfield recognized the psychology at work. The Graysons had perfected a system that turned victims into accomplices, forcing each family to participate in the destruction of others. Those who emerged alive carried the weight of complicity, ensuring their silence through shared guilt. "We ain't monsters," Caleb Grayson explained to the assembled families, his rifle resting casually across his forearms. "We're offering partnership. Join our community, contribute what you can, and these mountains will keep you fed and protected till Judgment Day." The lie wrapped around truth like ivy choking a tree. The mountains would indeed provide protection, but only from external threats. Internal dangers multiplied with each recruitment cycle, as stolen children grew into hardened adults who'd learned that violence was the price of belonging. Samuel Harwick attempted one final negotiation, offering his guiding services to the Grayson operation in exchange for safe passage for all families. But Ezekiel's weathered face split into a grin that revealed the calculated cruelty beneath mountain hospitality. "Already got guides, Samuel. What we need is fresh blood to keep our community strong." The sun reached its zenith as the last families made their choices. The Whitfield clan surrendered their 16-year-old daughter, Sarah. The Morgans gave up their eldest son and half their supplies. The Carvers agreed to winter servitude in exchange for spring passage. But 3 families refused the bargain entirely. The Ashfords, traveling with elderly grandparents and small children, declared they'd rather die free than live enslaved. The Pratts, a young couple expecting their first child, chose to fight rather than submit. Most dangerously, Rebecca Thornfield had been quietly organizing resistance among the single women and widows. Death had been patient, but patience was ending. As shadows lengthened across the hollow, Ezekiel Grayson's expression shifted from predatory amusement to something far more dangerous. The families who'd chosen resistance had just signed death warrants, not only for themselves, but for everyone whose cooperation had bought temporary safety. Because the Graysons had one rule that superseded all negotiations. No witnesses could be allowed to reach civilization with stories of what happened in the mountain gaps where spirits fed on human desperation. The crack of breaking branches echoed through the hollow as Abel Grayson moved through the underbrush like a hunting cat, his rifle trained on the Ashford family's eldest boy, who tried to slip away during the negotiations. The forest floor, carpeted with decades of fallen leaves, muffled footsteps, but couldn't silence the metallic click of weapons being readied for use. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and the Graysons were prepared to demonstrate why their mountain kingdom had remained unchallenged for 23 years. Rebecca Thornfield had spent the afternoon quietly moving between the resistant families, using her schoolteacher's authority to organize what she hoped might become coordinated defiance. But mountain-bred predators recognized the scent of rebellion long before city-educated women understood the futility of resistance. "Seems we got ourselves some troublemakers," Ezekiel announced, his voice carrying the casual menace of a man who'd crushed countless uprisings. "Folks who don't appreciate our hospitality." The Ashford patriarch, 62-year-old Benjamin, stood protectively in front of his family's wagon, with the dignity of someone who'd survived the revolution, only to face a different kind of tyranny. His arthritic hands gripped a flintlock pistol that hadn't been fired since Yorktown, but his eyes held the steady resolve of a man who decided that some things were worth dying for. "We came seeking passage, not slavery," Benjamin declared. "These mountains belong to God, not to thieves who prey on honest families." His words carried across the hollow with the clarity of church bells reaching every soul who'd already compromised their conscience for the promise of survival. The families who'd surrendered children and freedom felt the weight of his accusation like physical blows. But courage, however noble, couldn't overcome the mathematics of mountain warfare. Caleb Grayson's rifle spoke first. The thunderclap of black powder echoing off granite walls as Benjamin Ashford crumpled beside his wagon wheel. His wife's scream cut through gunsmoke that hung in the still air like incense at a funeral mass. Their 3 children clustered around their father's body, while his life's blood soaked into mountain soil that had drunk deeply from similar sacrifices over the decades. From a report by Captain James Morrison, North Carolina militia, filed March 10, 1800, found evidence of systematic predation against westward travelers. Estimated 40 to 50 wagon trains intercepted over 2 decades. Survivors scarce and reluctant to provide testimony. The Pratt family's resistance lasted 30 seconds longer. Young Daniel Pratt managed to wound Marcus Grayson with a hunting knife before Josiah's rifle ended his defiance. His pregnant wife Mary collapsed over his body, her keening wail joining the symphony of mountain violence that had claimed so many dreams of Tennessee prosperity. Rebecca Thornfield realized with crystalline clarity that organization meant nothing without firepower. Her carefully planned resistance crumbled like autumn leaves before winter wind as the Graysons demonstrated why talking rarely defeated shooting. But surrender brought no mercy. The lesson had to be complete. The price of defiance made clear to every surviving witness. Ezekiel Grayson walked among the fallen with the methodical pace of a farmer checking his harvest, ensuring that resistance had been thoroughly crushed and that cooperation would flow more freely from the remaining families. "Anyone else feeling rebellious?" he asked the huddled survivors. "Anyone else think these mountains owe them free passage?" The silence stretched like a held breath, while children pressed their faces against their mothers' skirts, trying to unsee what mountain justice looked like when it wore human faces and carried loaded weapons. Martha Creighton pulled her son James closer, knowing now that surrender meant survival for her daughters, even if it condemned her boy to a lifetime of mountain servitude. The widow's choice had been made for her by the blood soaking into October leaves. The complicit families watched in silence. Thomas Brennan averted his eyes as his eldest daughters were led away by Marcus and Josiah Grayson, their mountain husbands, already planning wedding ceremonies that would be indistinguishable from auction sales. His wife Catherine wept quietly, but she wept for her own daughters, not for the Ashford children, now orphaned by their father's principles. What separated survivors from corpses wasn't morality or courage, but the willingness to become accomplices in their own degradation. The Graysons had perfected a system that transformed victims into collaborators, ensuring that those who emerged alive would carry the weight of complicity to their graves. William Henderson helped drag bodies away from the wagons, his carpentry skills already being put to use building crosses for mountain graves. His hands shook as he worked, but he worked steadily, understanding that useful collaboration bought his family another day of life. "Practical folks," Ezekiel observed with satisfaction as he watched the cleanup proceed. Mountains respect practical thinking, but practicality had costs that wouldn't be calculated until survivors reached civilization, if they ever did. The psychological wounds of watching neighbors murdered for the crime of dignity would fester in ways that mountain isolation couldn't heal. Samuel Harwick supervised the burial detail with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose soul had already died. The guide who'd promised safe passage had become an undertaker, preparing graves for families who trusted his expertise and maps and testimonials that had led them into a killing ground disguised as wilderness passage. As darkness settled over the hollow like a burial shroud, the surviving families faced a new reality. They were no longer travelers seeking new lives, but prisoners whose continued existence depended on their willingness to participate in the system that had destroyed their neighbors. The mountains had claimed their tribute, but the feeding was far from finished. The stench of wood smoke and unwashed bodies hung thick in the mountain air. As the surviving wagon train members were marched deeper into Grayson territory, their feet following deer paths that wound between ancient hemlocks like arteries feeding a hidden heart. The sound of children weeping mixed with the creak of wagon wheels navigating slopes never meant for civilization's burden. What they discovered in that hidden hollow would reveal the true scope of the Grayson operation and why no authorities had ever successfully tracked the missing wagon trains. The compound sprawled across a natural basin ringed by granite cliffs, a fortress carved from living rock and human desperation. Log cabins clustered around a central longhouse like subjects bowing to their king, while terraced gardens showed evidence of permanent settlement dating back decades. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, suggesting a population far larger than the 5 Grayson men who'd intercepted the wagon train. "Welcome to New Eden," Ezekiel announced with proprietary pride. "Finest community in all the mountain country." But Martha Creighton's schoolteacher eyes recognized something that chilled her more than the October wind cutting through the valley. The children playing around the cabins bore no family resemblance to each other or to the adults supervising them. They moved with the careful precision of young people who'd learned that survival meant absolute obedience. These weren't families, but collections of survivors assembled from decades of recruiting expeditions. A woman emerged from the longhouse to greet the newcomers, her dress clean but patched, her manner subservient yet watchful. She might have been 30 or 50, her mountain life having carved premature lines around eyes that held the hollow stare of someone who'd seen too much and forgotten how to feel appropriately about it. "I'm Patience Grayson," she announced to the assembled captives. "I'll be teaching you the rules that keep this community prosperous." But Patience hadn't been born a Grayson. Rebecca Thornfield recognized something in her speech patterns, the carefully buried traces of Pennsylvania German that marked her as another stolen prize from some long-forgotten wagon train. From the testimony of Sarah Mitchell, recovered from the Grayson compound in 1821, Patience claimed she'd been there 15 years. Said she'd been Sarah Hoffman when she arrived, traveling with her husband and infant son to settle in Kentucky. The husband died resisting. The son grew up believing Ezekiel was his father. The orientation revealed the compound's horrifying efficiency. Children taken from wagon trains were raised as Grayson family members, their original identities systematically erased through isolation and indoctrination. Women became wives or household servants, their previous lives dismissed as dreams from a world that no longer existed. Men either joined the raiding parties or provided skilled labor to maintain the mountain kingdom. Most disturbing were the willing collaborators. Samuel Harwick wasn't the first guide to lead wagon trains into Grayson territory. The compound housed 3 other men who'd once promised safe passage to westward families, now serving as recruitment specialists who understood exactly which promises would lure the desperate into mountain traps. "Civilization's a disease," one former guide explained to the newest captives. "Up here, we live natural. Strong take what they need, weak serve the strong, and everyone knows their place." The psychology was brutally effective. Isolated from outside contact, surrounded by people who'd accepted their fate, new arrivals faced overwhelming pressure to normalize their captivity. Those who resisted too long simply disappeared into the mountain forests, their absence serving as object lessons for others contemplating defiance. Martha Creighton watched her son James being led away for mountain education, while her daughters were assigned to women's quarters where they'd learn domestic skills that would make them valuable to future Grayson. Sons. The widow's tears fell silently, understanding that grief was a luxury she could no longer afford. But Rebecca Thornfield had been studying their captors. The compound's isolation was both its strength and its weakness. Cut off from outside supplies, the Graysons depended entirely on what they could steal, grow, or manufacture from local resources. Their population growth required constant recruitment, but too many disappearances would eventually attract official attention. More importantly, The psychological control that kept captives compliant also created brittleness. The system worked as long as everyone participated in the shared delusion that this was normal, even beneficial. But if that consensus cracked, if enough people remembered who they'd been before the mountains claimed them, the entire structure might collapse. The schoolteacher began planning. That night, assigned to a cabin with 6 other women from various wagon trains, Rebecca listened to their stories. Mary Henderson had been there 3 years, taken when her family's farm wagon broke down in Grayson territory. Susan Wright had arrived 5 years ago, traveling alone to join her brother in Nashville. Alice Porter couldn't even remember her original destination anymore. Her past dissolved in mountain routine. But they all remembered their children. The Graysons' greatest mistake lay in their thoroughness. By keeping families partially intact, they'd preserved emotional connections that mere survival couldn't erase. Mothers still recognized their stolen sons, even after years of indoctrination. Wives still grieved husbands murdered for resisting recruitment. Love, it turned out, was harder to kill than hope. As winter approached and the mountain passes became impassable, Rebecca understood that escape attempts would have to wait for spring. But preparation could begin immediately, building networks of trust among people who'd been trained to see each other as competitors for Grayson approval. The compound of the lost was about to discover that some prisoners refused to stay broken, and that the strongest walls are often built from the very people they're designed to contain. The crack of breaking ice echoed through the mountain hollow like rifle shots as March snowmelt swelled the creeks into roaring torrents, carrying away the remnants of winter's grip, along with the bones of those who hadn't survived the compound's brutal mathematics. The smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation mixed with something else, something that made the surviving captives understand that spring brought more than just freedom from snow-locked isolation. The thaw had revealed what winter had hidden, and the Grayson compound was about to face a reckoning 23 years in the making. Rebecca Thornfield stood at the women's cabin window, counting the fresh graves that dotted the compound's perimeter like accusations written in turned earth. 17 souls had fed the mountain soil during the cold months, their deaths attributed to natural causes by captors who'd long since perfected the art of plausible denial. But each burial had eroded something fundamental in the compound's psychology. The survivors were no longer willing to pretend this was normal. Martha Creighton had become the unofficial leader of what the women quietly called the Rememberers, those who refused to let mountain isolation erase their previous identities. Her near execution had transformed her from frightened widow into something harder, more dangerous. She moved through the compound like a living reminder that resistance was possible, even against overwhelming odds. "My boy James ain't forgotten who he was before these devils stole him," she whispered to the circle of women who gathered each night to share memories of their former lives. "None of our children have to forget if we don't let them." But memory was becoming a luxury the compound could no longer afford. The winter's losses had strained the Grayson operation beyond sustainable limits. Too many useful workers had died. Too many wives had succumbed to despair and neglect. Too many children had been buried in ground that was supposed to nurture the next generation of mountain-born Graysons. Ezekiel's carefully balanced system was collapsing under the weight of its own cruelty. From a dispatch by Lieutenant Colonel Henry Knox, North Carolina Militia, dated April 18, 1800, increased reports of missing wagon trains suggest systematic predation in the Blue Ridge territories. Organizing expedition to investigate remote settlements of questionable legitimacy. The Patriarch's response to crisis was predictably violent. Spring would bring new wagon trains through the mountain passes, fresh opportunities for recruitment to replace winter's losses. But this year's raids would need to be more aggressive, more thorough. No witnesses could be left alive to carry tales of mountain justice to civilization. That meant eliminating the current captives who'd grown too troublesome to trust. Rebecca had anticipated this outcome, understanding that tyrants rarely reformed when threatened. Instead, they escalated, until something broke completely. Her months of careful organization had prepared the compound's prisoners for this moment, building networks of trust and communication that could function even under extreme pressure. The schoolteacher's plan required perfect timing and absolute commitment. Spring floods had made the mountain passes treacherous but not impassable. A coordinated escape attempt might succeed if enough people were willing to risk everything simultaneously. But failure would mean massacre for everyone involved. "They're planning to kill us all before the next wagon train arrives," she announced to the assembled women during their nightly gathering. "We can die here as victims, or we can die trying to warn the next families heading into these mountains." The decision split the group like lightning splitting oak. Some, broken by years of captivity, couldn't imagine existence beyond the compound walls. Others, like Martha Creighton, embraced the possibility of death over continued enslavement. The debate raged in whispers. While outside, the Grayson men sharpened their weapons and discussed which captives had outlived their usefulness. But the choice was taken from them when young Abel Grayson made a mistake that changed everything. Drunk on mountain whiskey and convinced of his own invincibility, the youngest Grayson son attempted to force himself on Martha's 15-year-old daughter, Catherine. The girl's screams brought her mother running, along with half the women in the compound. What followed was a fury that years of oppression had compressed into explosive potential. Martha Creighton's frying pan connected with Abel's skull with a sound like splitting firewood. The mountain-born predator dropped like a felled tree, blood pooling beneath his head, while his intended victim sobbed in her mother's arms. The compound fell silent, except for the sound of running water and Martha's labored breathing. "Well," she said to the circle of witnesses, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she'd done. "Reckon there's no going back now." The killing of Abel Grayson transformed captives into rebels, victims into warriors. Within minutes, the compound erupted into violence that had been building for decades. Women armed themselves with kitchen knives and agricultural tools. Men seized weapons from guard posts. Children who'd been raised as Graysons found themselves choosing between their captors and their blood families. Death came calling, with interest. But 23 years of mountain warfare had taught the remaining Grayson men how to respond to uprising. They retreated to defensive positions, using their superior firepower to contain the rebellion while planning a counterattack that would restore order through systematic slaughter. The spring thaw had indeed brought freedom to the compound, but freedom written in blood and measured in the courage required to choose death over continued degradation. Gunpowder smoke drifted through the mountain hollow like morning mist as the sun climbed above granite peaks stained red with more than dawn light. The compound that had housed dozens of stolen lives lay silent except for the crackle of flames consuming log cabins and the distant cry of carrion birds already circling overhead. Only 5 figures picked their way through the carnage toward the mountain passes that led back to civilization, carrying with them a story that would haunt the Blue Ridge for generations. Rebecca Thornfield pressed a blood-soaked cloth against the bullet wound in her shoulder while supporting Martha Creighton, whose left leg dragged uselessly behind her. Behind them came James Creighton, no longer the bright-eyed boy who'd volunteered to stay behind for his family's safety, but a hollow-eyed young man who'd killed his first father figure with a splitting axe. Catherine Creighton clutched her infant sister, born during the winter to a mother who'd somehow found the strength to bring life into that place of death. The 5th survivor wasn't human, but 4-legged. Ezekiel Grayson's hunting dog, a massive hound who'd switched loyalty when the shooting started, following the scent of freedom rather than the commands of dead masters. "Keep moving," Rebecca gasped, her school teacher's authority intact despite everything. Military patrols coming up from the valley saw their cook smoke yesterday morning. The battle for the compound had lasted 3 days and 2 nights, a brutal accounting that settled decades of accumulated injustice with interest. But victory had come at a price that made the survivors question whether death might have been preferable to the memories they now carried. From the official report of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Knox, filed May 2, 1800, found evidence of extensive criminal operation targeting westward travelers. Compound destroyed by unknown parties before military arrival. Estimated 40 to 60 casualties. 5 survivors recovered, reluctant to provide detailed testimony. Martha Creighton had personally killed 3 Grayson men, including Caleb, the eldest son who'd supervised her boy's mountain education with calculated cruelty. Her frying pan had proved as deadly as any rifle, when wielded with maternal fury, distilled into pure violence. But each blow had cost her something that peaceful sleep would never restore. The other captives had fought with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that surrender meant systematic execution. Kitchen knives found throats, farming tools, crushed skulls, and burning cabins consumed the evidence of 23 years of systematic predation against innocent families seeking new lives in Western territories. But some secrets had survived the flames. Rebecca had found Ezekiel's journal in the main house before the fire consumed it, pages detailing not just the Harwick massacre, but dozens of other wagon trains that had vanished without trace over the decades. The estimated count reached into the hundreds, entire communities erased from existence to feed the mountain family's sustainable horror. They kept records, she told Martha, as they stumbled down the deer path that would eventually lead to civilization. Names, dates, what they took from each family. Evidence that could hang every authority who ignored the disappearances. But evidence required witnesses willing to testify, and the 5 survivors carried trauma that made coherent testimony nearly impossible. How do you explain to a courthouse that entire families had been enslaved, that children had been raised as predators, that systematic murder had masqueraded as mountain hospitality for over 2 decades? The dog whined and pressed closer as thunder rumbled through the peaks. Spring storms were building, the kind that would wash away tracks and scatter evidence across thousands of acres of wilderness. By the time investigators reached the compound, nature would have reclaimed what remained of the Grayson kingdom. Young James spoke for the first time since the escape began, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who'd aged decades in a single winter. What do we tell them about the others? The ones who didn't make it out? The question hung between them like smoke from distant fires. 42 members of the Harwick wagon train had entered these mountains 8 months ago. 3 had died resisting initial capture. 17 had perished during the brutal winter. 22 had fallen during the compound uprising, including Martha's younger daughters who'd chosen to fight rather than flee. Mathematics, written in blood and measured in empty graves. We tell them the truth, Rebecca decided. All of it. Every name, every family, every child stolen from parents who trusted guides and maps and promises of safe passage. But truth was a luxury that traumatized survivors couldn't always afford. When the military patrol found them 2 days later, collapsed beside a mountain stream and barely conscious from blood loss and exhaustion, their stories came in fragments too horrific for official reports. The investigation that followed uncovered evidence of systematic predation, but failed to locate any surviving Grayson family members. The compound's ashes revealed human remains, but couldn't distinguish between victims and perpetrators. The case was classified as resolved through natural justice, filed away with dozens of other frontier incidents that defied civilized explanation. Some said Martha Creighton never fully recovered from her mountain ordeal, spending her remaining years talking to children who existed only in memory. Others claimed Rebecca Thornfield used her schoolteacher credentials to warn wagon trains away from the Blue Ridge passes, probably saving hundreds of lives through the simple act of testimony. James Creighton disappeared into the Western Territories, carrying scars that went deeper than the ones visible on his hands and face. His sister Catherine grew up in Philadelphia, raised by distant relatives who never spoke of what had happened in the mountains, though neighbors sometimes heard her crying in languages she claimed not to remember. But even today, hikers in the Blue Ridge report finding the remnants of old cabins hidden in remote hollows, their foundations built on graves too numerous to count. Some say the mountain streams still run red after heavy rains, carrying minerals that look suspiciously like old blood, down from heights where civilization learned its limitations and human nature revealed its truest face. The wagon train that tried to cross the Appalachian wilderness in 1799 had sought new lives in Tennessee territory, but only 5 made it far enough to carry their stories back to a world that preferred not to hear them. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.